Welcome, everyone, to meeting number 63 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. We will start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 15th, 2021. November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Start with committee business, subcommittee business. Your subcommittee met last week to consider business of the committee going forward and agreed to a number of items. You all received a copy by email of the fourth report of the subcommittee on agenda and procedure. Does the committee wish to adopt this report? We have an agreement?
Mr. Chair, I have my hand up.
Yes, please, go ahead.
And I apologize, Mr. Chair, but I'll likely have my hand up quite a bit today, so we'll just draw your attention to that. Could you read out for the committee members the subcommittee report, please? It's relatively short.
I'm sorry, you want to read? I'll read it, absolutely. So your subcommittee met on Friday, April 28th, 2023 to consider the business of the committee and agreed to make the following recommendations. 1, that 5 meetings, including 1 meeting with the Minister of Public Safety, be dedicated to Bill C-20, an act establishing the Public Complaints and Review Commission and amending certain acts and statutory instruments. 2, that the members send their list of proposed witnesses for Bill C-20 to the clerk no later than Friday, May 12th, 2023. That the clerk takes the necessary steps to organize a total of 4 additional hours of committee meeting to be held during the week of May 1st and or, if needed, the following week, given the cancellation of the meetings on May 5th and May 19th, 2023. And that is respectfully submitted by your chair. So do we have agreement to ratify this decision of the subcommittee? Ms. Dancho, your hand is still up, or is it again?
It's up again. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to confirm that the subcommittee, just so I'm clear on the wording, it's to bring in essentially 2 more 2-hour meetings or 4 total hours of additional committee time because 2 committees or 2 Friday committee slots were eliminated. So this isn't extra meetings per se, just making up for 2 that were eliminated outside the control of this committee. Is that correct?
That is my understanding as well. And in that vein, we do have approval to extend for an extra hour today. We have a potential for 2 hours on Thursday and potential for 1 hour next week, although all of that is a little blurry right now. Thursday is not on. Okay,
and then just to be clear, if I may, so if as you've outlined, if that is done, then the obligation from the subcommittee is completed. This subcommittee report is not agreeing to any additional committee hours outside of what you've outlined, just to be clear.
That is correct. The subcommittee agreed to 4 hours to be allocated either this week and next week, or somehow in the 2 weeks period.
Okay, and this will be my last comment. I just want to underline that in particular that we are supportive of making up for the time that we are losing because of those 2 lost Fridays, but the Conservatives are not supportive of many additional hours to make up for the fact that we have been waiting 6 weeks to see the minister to complete the consultations on the previously withdrawn amendments. So just to be clear, Conservatives are not supportive of any additional time over and beyond making up for those 2 Fridays. It is not the committee's fault that the Liberal government took its time getting to the position that we are, and the committee is not under an obligation to double up or triple up the time that we are meeting and to further along things more quickly as a result of the very long process that this has undertaken since November. That is not the fault of Conservative members, and we will not be speeding up this process in any way. I just want to make that very clear.
Thank you. I'm so advised. Is there any further intervention on this matter? Go ahead, Mr. Motz.
Thank you, Chair. Can you just clarify again the times that you are thinking there might be some extra meeting?
This week and next week.
So we have no dates or anything.
We get an hour today,
Yes.
So that would leave 3
Right.
further hours to be acquired as of when we're able to get them, and that requires the help of the whips and the House resources and so forth. So.
Did I hear the clerk suggest that Thursday that you were planning is out?
Well, I had heard previously that we might be able to get 2 hours this coming Thursday, but apparently that's not the case, so.
Okay.
I wait developments, and we'll do the best we can to get those hours
Next week.
whenever we can get them.
Whenever.
It's
Fair
going to have to be tomorrow or Thursday or next week, so,
I got it.
No.
okay? Mr. Shipley?
Sorry, and I'm not trying to drag this out either, but we all have plans, we all have travel plans, we all have work plans, other meetings. I'm hearing we're not doing Thursday, and then I'm hearing we might be doing Thursday. That's only 2 days from now. Is there a possibility we're doing Thursday or not doing Thursday?
Mr. Clerk, can you advise, please?
Our request for sitting Thursday evening was denied, so
So
by
it's
the
not,
services of the House of Commons.
So that's in the, okay.
We didn't want Thursday evening anyway.
With you there.
There you go.
So it was,
And is tomorrow likely impossible as well?
There's no request made for tomorrow, so the only options for sitting this week would be another committee to cancel his own meeting and having your whips to decides to take this slot, the times this
We
time.
have it Friday morning at the Liberals Convention.
So the other request that was made was an
I was just
extension.
joking.
Sorry.
I was joking.
You're trying to intrude on my committee, or my convention time, I see.
I wouldn't do that.
I understand. Okay, any further interventions? Is it the will of the committee to adopt this report? I believe we have a consensus. Thank you all. That being said, we shall carry on with our further business. So pursuant to the order of reference of Thursday, June 23rd, 2022, the committee resumes consideration of Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, firearms. The committee resumes clause-by-clause consideration, and I welcome once again, after a long absence, our officials, and good to see you, and we'll do our best to, get this done. So at the point where we last engaged clause by clause, we were embroiled in a rigorous debate on G4, which has, the amendment has been withdrawn, and that effectively adjourns that particular debate. So we will continue. Sorry, I forgot to introduce our officials. So we have, from the Department of Justice, we have Marianne Breese, Counsel, Criminal Law Policy Section. Paula Clarke, Counsel, Criminal Law Policy Section. Phaedra Glushek, Counsel, Criminal Law Policy Section. From the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, we have Rachel Mainville-Dale, Acting Director General, Firearms Policy. And from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we have Rob Daly, Director, Strategic Policy, Canadian Firearms Program, and Kelly Paquette, Director General, Canadian Firearms Program. And once again, thank you for joining us today, and your participation is much appreciated. Okay, so we will recommence as close as I can figure out to where we are. So you should all have received a new package of amendments. And we start at this point with G 3.1. I believe that is standing in the name of Ms. Demoff. Please go ahead.
Chair, and I would like to move G 3.1, which deals with ghost guns, or 3D printed guns, as they're also known. And essentially, when G4 was withdrawn, an important part of that amendment was a change in Clause I that would incorporate firearm parts into the legislation. Why that is important is because ghost guns, or 3D printed guns that rely on actual firearm parts to be usable. All members can agree that this growing issue needs to be addressed urgently. It was actually part of our study on guns and gangs that we were able to produce a unanimous report on. Many of us went to the RCMP gun vault, and we were able to see how quick and easy it is for criminals to 3D print the receiver portion of a firearm illegally. I've met with police services across the country who've told me how worried they are about ghost guns infiltrating our communities. Investigators like Michael Rowe of the Vancouver Police Service, who colleagues will remember appeared at our committee during our study on guns and gangs, and who my colleague, Mr. Noor Mohammed, and I met in Montreal, or in Vancouver, he emphasized the need to create legislative solutions to address this gap so police have the tools that they need to apprehend those creating ghost guns. I'm just going to quote some of Inspector Rowe's testimony when he appeared at committee. And he said, for one example, one of the trends we're seeing out here in Vancouver right now is the use of privately made firearms or ghost guns. During the gang conflict, we're seeing more ghost guns, specifically in the hands of people who are involved in active murder conspiracies or people who are believed to be working as hired contract killers. Ghost guns can be 3D printed or modified from what's called a polymer 80 handgun. Modern 3D printing materials can produce a durable firearm capable of shooting hundreds of rounds without a failure. For example, one of my teams recently completed an investigation in which we executed search warrants on a residential home. Inside this home, we located a sophisticated firearms manufacturing operation capable of producing 3D printed firearms. They had firearm suppressors, and they were completing airsoft conversions, converting airsoft pistols into fully functioning firearms. So this amendment that I put forward, colleagues, is in direct response to Inspector Rowe's ask, where he said, quote, "I'd respectfully like to submit that a potential solution would be to bring in legislative remedies to regulate the possession, sale, and importation of firearms parts, such as barrels, slides, and trigger assemblies. This type of legislation would give us, the police, the necessary tools to be able to seize these items, get active enforcement action, and more effectively target the manufacturing of privately made firearms," end quote. Police services across the country are sounding the alarm on this problem, and the amendments we're introducing to address ghost guns is another reason why C-21 is an essential piece of legislation that will increase public safety. There are also many amendments coming forward that will add the words firearm part to legislation, and this will help address the ever-growing problem of ghost guns in our country. So in order to do all the other pieces that we need to do with firearm parts, we first need to pass G 3.1. So I'm asking for everyone's support on an issue that is a growing concern across the country and will actually put us ahead of gangs and organized crime, and will truly make a difference for police services right across the country. So I'm hoping that colleagues will support this. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So we have speakers, Mr. Julian, followed by Mr. Motz. Please go ahead, Mr. Julian.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to speak briefly because this is, I think, fundamentally important to pass, and the bill, particularly the provisions related to ghost guns and cracking down on criminals, is something that we need to move forward on. Jitancho referenced the delay, and she's quite right. There's been a delay on the government side for the last few months. That being said, now that we're moving forward again, I believe we need to move forward in an effective way, and here's why. I mean, we know to what extent ghost guns are appearing right across this country. In the United States, the Biden administration has cracked down on ghost guns. They, in the United States, law enforcement have seized over 20,000 in the past year of illegally manufactured, untraceable ghost guns. In Canada, as you'll recall, Mr. Chair, we had the Ministry of Justice before us, and they, up until that last week when we've asked to start compiling the figures, actually don't have figures that they can share with us, but presumably the increase has been as dramatic as it has in the United States, because certainly anecdotally, in my region, in our region of the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, we're seeing a remarkable tragic increase in the number of ghost guns right across the country in certain jurisdictions, up to 10 times, even 40 times the number of seized ghost guns, untraceable weapons. So the reality of cracking down on criminals means adopting this amendment. There are many amendments to come to deal with ghost guns, but I think we're all aware, all four parties around the table, of the risk that comes from not taking action and closing the loopholes that exist currently in the law for ghost guns. Certainly law enforcement has signaled this to us as well, so I'm hoping that we would rapidly pass this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Motz, followed by Madame Michaud.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just have a couple of questions, I suppose, a number of questions in regards to this. I'm curious to know, and we are targeting, so to speak, ghost guns in this particular legislation. This particular amendment is what you're doing, but we don't mention them. I think it would be helpful if we actually mention what we're talking about. We actually mention ghost guns, and that, you know, it certainly is an issue that has you know, taken off across the country, and it's something that has to be addressed. We agree. The other thing that I would like to ask the officials is, currently, correct me if I'm wrong, please. Currently, there is nothing prohibiting a member of the public from ordering parts for a firearm from the U.S. and having them brought into Canada. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So if that's the case, and ghost guns require the printing of them requires some metal parts, right? We know that. Would it not be a prudent addition here to have anybody who orders, who brings firearm parts into the country requires a PAL or an RPAL in order to do so? Would that not solve the problem we're actually after, or help me understand what some nuances here might be?
So we can't speak to what other motions could or could not do unless we are being given permission to speak to motions that are possibly going to be introduced later. We have permission to do so from the chair?
If the committee permits, Mr. Noor Mohammed, I believe, wishes to respond to this. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm not done my intervention, but yes, please.
So I had proposed an amendment in this regard. I'm prepared to waive privilege on that specific one because
you waive privilege on all your ghost guns?
I'm happy to waive privilege on all my ghost guns amendments because I do think that this will
All your
answer
ghost guns personally? Or?
mine personally, as well as the yeah. No, I think it'd be important because if we're having a fruitful conversation about ghost guns, I think it's important to know that the importation of parts is something that, you know, we are seized with in these amendments as well.
Thank you, Mr. Noor Mohammed.
Monsieur Motz? Merci. Merci de votre réponse. En ce qui
The government is adding firearm part to various provisions in the criminal code, such as importation, so trafficking, smuggling offenses. So they will be added to that. There is no requirement currently in the law that someone has to have an RPAL or a PAL, but I can turn to my colleague from Public Safety who can speak to a motion being moved in the future.
Thank you. So there is a motion that you will see with regards to requiring a PAL, possession and acquisition license, in order to import or purchase a firearm part as it's going to be defined in this motion.
Just a PAL or an RPAL as well?
So it's going to be a PAL, possession and acquisition license.
Okay. So we're trying to tighten up ghost guns. We should probably include RPAL because, you know, as a person with a PAL can acquire, you know, you're not supposed to have a handgun if you don't have a, you know, if you don't have an RPAL.
May I suggest, Mr. Motz, that when those amendments come up, you could propose such an amendment?
Okay, fair enough. So speaking about ghost guns and the idea that we that we should have some changes to them. The motion's coming up, and in fairness to Mr. Mohammed, I have not reviewed too far ahead in some of the motions that are amendments that are coming forward. So I will reserve an opportunity to speak on this a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. Go now to Madame Michaud, followed by Ms. Dancho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to my colleague for having moved this particular amendment. I won't reiterate the arguments that have been made by my colleague as well as Mr. Julian's. We've seen with our own eyes when we visited the RCMP detachment the growing problem of ghost arms, and it's high time that we legislate on this issue. This is a new issue that police officers are facing, and many witnesses for this committee have told us how urgent it is that we legislate on this particular matter. So I won't elaborate further. The bloc will vote in favour of this amendment.
Merci, Madame. We'll go now to Ms. Dancho, followed by potentially Mr. Nur Mohammed. Ms. Dancho, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the remarks from Mr. Moth and from others. I have also heard these things from police across the country. In fact, Winnipeg police have been hard at work. They just made quite a large bust of ghost guns, dozens of them, in fact, that were going for $7,000 on the streets. I have talked to police forces and police officers who predict that this may overtake other firearms sort of being smuggled in. We know is also very popular. About 8 to 9 out of 10 of Toronto handguns used in crimes are smuggled. If criminals are able to easily print them, which they are increasingly so, as we've heard in this committee and from police officers in our own private conversations, this may overtake that actually. So I do believe it's imperative and support measures to do so. I do have a couple questions of clarification, however, really two quick things. So this in particular, so there's other motions, amendments that are being brought forward. So I appreciate Mr. Nur Mohammed allowing us to discuss those. This one in particular simply adds firearm part to prohibition orders and other things. Is that correct? Like it just amending some parts so far, and other amendments will kind of add firearm part to other areas of the Firearms Act. Is that a fair assessment?
Mr. Nur Mohammed is nodding in a sense.
He's nodding. Okay, thank you.
As are the officials.
Yes.
So.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for translating that. Another thing I wanted to ask, I believe the NWES and RCMP refers to firearm parts rather with a different term. They refer to it as essential components. Is that correct? And do we want to be consistent with that? Is that important? I just want to make sure that we're not being inconsistent. And within that, perhaps my question would be, is there a categorical difference between what the RCMP describes as essential component and firearm part, or are we talking about this same thing interchangeably?
I'm sorry.
So this definition is for the purposes of the criminal code, and then I can turn to my colleague about how they would operationalize this definition. The definition is with respect to the specific two specific parts, the barrels for firearms and slides for handguns, which are the most common pieces that are used. If it was any broader, or if it was broader, it would include possibly all parts of a firearm, and we wanted to limit the scope, not we, the government, wanted to limit the scope to those two that are the most difficult and common. Right. And I'll turn to my colleague, Kelly, for operationalizing.
Thank you. Component and parts are used interchangeable.
Thank you, Ms. Dancho.
Okay, thank you.
And Mr. Nur Mohammed's already made his intervention, so we will, Mr. Ruff, go ahead, please.
Just super quick on really on the operationalization of this, I guess, is there any, how's that going to be done, I guess, to some extent? Because, I mean, other things are serialized, there's ways to track things. Is there any plan to do that? It's just basically, if it's tied to a piece of legislation or a criminal code, and you're finding that, for lack of better terms, the illegal firearm, where somebody's not allowed to do it, if they're in possession of these parts and they don't have the appropriate PAL, or our PAL, depending on the firearm type we're talking about, basically that's how the charge would be laid. Is that sort of how it's going to be operationalized?
Thank you for the question. So the question is that in future motions, you are going to see that it's going to require a PAL in order to acquire or import a firearm part as defined, but the possession, like ammunition, is not going to be criminalized.
Any further interventions on this amendment? Seeing none, is it the will of the committee to pass this amendment? All in favor, say raise their hands. Opposed? Carried. Thank you all. We go now to G3.2. Ms. DeMoff, please.
Sorry, I was hitting the button. Well, thank you, colleagues, for supporting that amendment. It was an important one. I'm hoping I will get the same enthusiasm for the next amendment. As we know, our committee has been working hard to engage Canadians from all walks of life about how we can do more to protect communities from gun violence. When we decided to pull amendments G4 and G46, we were clear that we were committed to listening to Canadians of all backgrounds to ensure we get this important piece of legislation right. Now we've heard extensively from different experts in the field and from people representing the entire country. At committee here, we heard from and received written briefs from gun control advocates, Indigenous leaders, academics, survivors of gun violence, and medical professionals who all supported legislation to ban military-style assault weapons. Canadians support our government's efforts to ban firearms that exceed safe civilian use. Recently, our government received the final report of the Mass Casualty Commission, which examined the worst mass shooting in Canadian history. The MCC, as it's known, made a substantial list of thoughtful recommendations, including on gun control. They called on all governments to, quote, help implement these recommendations, which will contribute to ensuring safer communities for everyone. We all have work to do, and it's time to act, end quote. Mr. Chair, that's what the Liberal members of the committee intend to do, so this proposed amendment before the committee aligns with the recommendations put forward in the final report of the MCC. Today, Wendy Kukier of the Coalition for Gun Control released a statement which highlighted how impactful these amendments will be. She said, quote, no law is ever perfect, but Bill C-21 is a game changer for Canada and should be implemented as soon as possible. The law responds to most of the recommendations of the Mass Casualty Commission and the demands of the Coalition for Gun Control, which with more than 200 supporting organizations, has fought for stronger firearm laws for more than 30 years, end quote. The work of the MCC, the Coalition for Gun Control, and our committee has led to this moment. The work we will do here today will make Canada a safer place to call home. So I'd like to get into what's included in the new technical definition proposed in this amendment, because it does differ from the former definition that was put forward. So first and foremost, there is no list, so G46 will not be reintroduced. This new definition is forward-looking only. It provides the clarification that gun owners need and the protection gun control advocates have long called for. So let me be clear, the definition only applies to firearms that have yet to be created. Second, in drafting the previous amendment, the French interpretation of shotgun or rifle was drafted as fusil de chasse. The literal translation is a hunting firearm, which is obviously inconsistent with the intention of the provision, and that wording has been removed. Finally, the phrase designed to accept has been replaced with originally designed with. What we heard was that the previous language was too broad and that any firearm with a detachable magazine could realistically accept another. After listening to that feedback, we've updated our language. So, Mr. Chair, the committee and Canadians now know how the new definition differs from the previous one. So I'd like to get into the actual technical definition we put forward. The definition prohibited firearm in subsection 84(1) of the Act is amended by striking out or at the end of paragraph C, by adding or at the end of paragraph D, and by adding the following after paragraph D. E, a firearm is not a handgun, and that I discharges center fire ammunition in a semi-automatic manner. I was
Point of order. Sorry, Sorry, I apologize. to
Ms.
interrupt, Mr.
Dancho, on
Chair,
a point of order, please.
I believe the member misspoke. She mentioned a firearm is not a handgun. I think she meant to say a firearm that is not a handgun. I just mentioned it because I know it's important that we get this on the record.
I heard the same
so-
thing.
Okay.
I think your intervention is correct.
Sorry, what did I say?
You said a firearm that is, a firearm is not a handgun, I believe it was.
Sorry, a firearm that is not a handgun. Okay. Was originally designed with a detachable cartridge magazine with a capacity of 6 cartridges or more, and finally is designed and manufactured on or after the day on which this paragraph comes into force, and then in brackets, arme à feu prohibée. So I'd like to break down each element in a way that Canadians can understand, but before I do, Mr. Chair, I just want to be very clear. In order for a firearm to be determined to be prohibited by this new definition, all 4 elements must be met. So I'll start with that the definition does not apply to handguns. Our government is already taking decisive action on handguns by freezing the market, a measure which the vast majority of Canadians support. So we know the definition is not applying to handguns. The next element is that it only applies to semi-automatic firearms that shoot centerfire ammunition. As my colleagues will remember, Mr. Noor Mohammed did a Firearms 101 seminar. I won't get into all of that, but I will remind us that centerfire ammunition is ammunition that is larger than rimfire ammunition. And with rimfire, it's most commonly used in hunting firearms. We also know that semi-automatic is just one action that a firearm can be manufactured with. The semi-automatic
Point
action...
of order, Chair?
Mr. Ruff?
I just want to make sure if I heard Ms. Damoff correct. Did you say
Damoff,
that...
it's not Pamoff.
Sorry,
Pam's my first name.
Sorry, Pam. That you said that the majority of hunting firearms are rimfire? Is that what you said?
The most commonly found in hunting firearms.
Incorrect. That's fine.
Carry on.
Sorry, I've got multiple people whispering at me here. So semi-automatic action, and this is quoting Murray Smith from the RCMP, quote, where much of the loading action is done automatically by the firearm. It's like having an automatic transition on a car versus a standard. It is automatically for the user, unquote. All of these actions, like a bolt action, lever, hinge, and pump, actions that require more manual effort to reload, remain unaffected by this new proposed definition. So for folks following along at home, we're talking about guns that fire larger bullets in which most of the loading is done automatically. This seems pretty reasonable to me, and it certainly does to the members on this side. The next criteria that must be met is that a firearm that was originally designed with a detachable cartridge magazine with a capacity of 6 cartridges or more. Again, for those at home, we can refer to cartridges colloquially as bullets. It's also important to note that the legal magazine capacity in Canada is 5. Anything larger is deemed to be too big and is illegal. So we're only talking about guns that fire a large number of bullets where much of the loading action is done automatically. The definition is forward-looking only. It applies only to guns that have not been invented yet. And in the amendments I submitted yesterday, I also included a provision that will ensure there's a 5-year legislative review of this definition to ensure the right balance has been struck. In summary, this definition only applies to future guns, which are designed to fire a large number of big bullets where much of the loading action is done automatically. In the words of the Doctors for Protection from Guns, these amendments are, quote, a victory for science, public health, and Canadian values. What we have before us is a reasonable and technical definition. It also, and I want to stress that, it does not take away from the firearms that were deemed prohibited in the 2020 Order in Council that banned 1,500 kinds of assault-style firearms, including the AR-15 from our country. Those firearms remain prohibited. Today, what we have before us is a new amendments, including a new technical definition which provides clarity and sets an objective standard of what constitutes a prohibitive weapon. It's a technical definition that the majority of Canadians support and was supported by the Mass Casualty Commission. I've been on this Public Safety Committee since I was elected in 2015. I've met with and listened to survivors of gun violence, domestic abuse, and mass shootings who've worked with our government to introduce legislation to strengthen gun control and enhance our public safety. That's why in my community of Oakville, North Burlington, I hear from my constituents about the need to strengthen our gun control laws. One life lost to gun violence is one too many. As someone who has advocated for 8 years for a strategy to address and prevent gun violence, it gives me great pride to be part of a government who's introduced this legislation, which is the strongest piece of gun control legislation in our lifetime. I was really disappointed to see already my colleagues across the way in the Conservative Party are spreading misinformation. Bill C-21 is a strong piece of legislation and has important aspects beyond the technical definition that I've talked about today. Canadians are concerned about their safety and about gun violence. There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, Mr. Chair, to address gun violence and crime, but Bill C-21 is one tool in our toolbox to address gun violence specifically and ban guns that were designed to kill the most people in the shortest amount of time. It will bolster border and law enforcement capacity, reduce the number of firearms in circulation in Canada, stop gun crime before it starts, and create red and yellow flag laws and provide resources to help combat domestic violence involving firearms. We're making critical investments in housing, mental health supports, and youth programs to address the root causes of crime and set young people up for success. We also created the first ever national action plan to end gender-based violence. All these investments and actions by our government, including Bill C-21, is part of our government's broader strategy to keep Canadians safe and healthy. Bill 21 is a critical bill that needs to be passed as soon as possible. And I just want to reiterate, Mr. Chair, we all need to be taking a public health approach to gun control, and this is one part of that approach, and I call on my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muff. We go next to Mr. Julien, followed by Ms. Dancho, followed by Madame Michaud. Mr. Julien, please go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll speak briefly again because we have 160-odd pages of amendments, and I know that it is now that we're back on the rails, given, as I mentioned earlier, the issue around ghost guns, we have to proceed in an effective way. I will be supporting this amendment, not only for the reasons that Ms. Damoff cited, the Mass Casualty Commission made strong recommendations in this regard, but also because of an issue that we've raised in the House, the NDP has raised around the issue of manufacturers not being subject to a tight regime around approval and classification. Manufacturers and importers, as we heard in our questioning of witnesses that came from the ministry, aren't subject to an ironclad process right now, and the companies can classify firearms in their own way. That's not appropriate, given that loophole can lead to abuse, either inadvertent or conscious. So I'll be supporting the technical amendment because what it does is help to close those loopholes. That's very, very important. So these amendments around ghost guns crack down on criminals. This amendment subjects manufacturers and importers to a regime that is tighter and ensures that they have to go through a due process. That is a shift away from going, we're saying to responsible gun owners that the focus of the bill will be on you. And I think that's an important element to retain as we go through the discussions of these amendments, that if we're looking to tighten the rules, manufacturers and importers are part of that. and certainly cracking down on criminals. So I'll be supporting this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. We go now to Ms. Dancho. Ms. Dancho, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I have a number of comments and then some very important questions for the officials for clarification. I know that this area, formerly withdrawn G4 and the list that sort of accompanied that has not been brought back, which I appreciate, caused a lot of turmoil, and that was, over 4 or 5 months ago, and it also caused a lot of stress both in the hunting community and in the anti-gun community as well. And I just want to acknowledge that I recognize that there were threats made to many members of this committee and to officials. And I just think it's important that as we get into this very important democratic discussion that we are tasked with, that is our duty at this committee, I wanted to acknowledge that. Conservative members, myself included, have not been immune to that abuse and those threats. So I understand on a personal level how difficult it is for many of us to come to the table and have an honest democratic dialogue about this. So, Mr. Chair, I did want to acknowledge that going forward, and it is my goal to ensure that we each have the opportunity, the freedom, and the protection to fight in our corner and make our points known, but that I fully denounce, as do all Conservative members, any abuse or violence directed towards any member of this committee or any member of government. So I just want to be very clear about that. Okay, so going to this definition, I appreciate Ms. DeMoff's overview. I appreciate it. And I will get to some questions, but I did want to address a few things that she said. And I appreciate, again, this is a heated debate, or has been in the past, but I don't appreciate the allegation of misinformation over the past 24 hours from Conservative members. And I did want to address some misinformation. I think that was shared perhaps by accident by Ms. DeMoff. Just to be clear, hunting guns take center fire ammunition. It would be completely inhumane to hunt a deer or anything larger than a deer with a rimfire. Center fire ammunition is extremely common. You cannot hunt a big animal with a rimfire, or it would be not humane. So that is very standard, and just want to be very clear about that. Since, again, we are talking about hunting rifles in many cases in this regard.
Point of order, Chair. Could I just apologize to the honourable member and
Ms. DeMoff, on a point of order, please go.
I just want to apologize to the honourable member and recognize that I misspoke. What I should have said was that rimfire will not be impacted by the definition, but you're absolutely correct, and I apologize.
No problem. Thank you.
Carry on,
It's
please.
a complicated issue with lots of details, and I do have a number of just clarifying questions because I have been bombarded, as I know all members, certainly on this side on the Conservative side, have received a lot from their constituents and others. So I did want to make a couple other statements in particular. Just on the French interpretation in particular, it was fusil de chasse, and as you mentioned, as Ms. DeMoff mentioned, that is hunting rifle as a direct translation. So can we just clarify what the French word is now, and is that still an accurate French word to describe what's in this new definition? That's my first question. I have a few.
Alors, so with regards to, in English, it talks about a firearm that is not a handgun, and in French, it's a very literal translation, une arme à feu qui n'est pas une arme de poing.
A firearm that is not a handgun.
Okay, thank you. There was a mention from Ms. DeMoff of what the difference is between this definition and the last one, and just so folks are clear, I'm just going to briefly outline what the last one was, if you'll just bear with me. I do think it's important given how contentious this was at the time. So the last definition that was withdrawn was a firearm that is a rifle or a shotgun that is capable of discharging center fire ammunition in a semi-automatic manner, and that is designed to accept a detachable cartridge magazine with a capacity greater than 5 cartridges of the type for which the firearm was originally designed. So can we be a bit more specific and elaborate on what specifically is different in the new one versus the old one? Because I'm really not clear. I believe it was something about original design, but if we can get into further detail about the difference, please. And then I have more questions.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So in terms of the definition has been simplified. So other than the change with regards to rifle or shotgun, that has been changed to a firearm that is not a handgun. With regards to capture the government's intent to capture firearms that have a detachable magazine and how to differentiate those that are intended for small detachable magazines that are quite acceptable in Canada for hunting purposes, is to how to capture that concept of a large capacity magazines, or those that are designed for those large capacity magazines. That language has been simplified to the was originally designed with a detachable magazine with a capacity of 6 cartridges or more.
Okay, so if I'm clear then, so the original design, so if I have a firearm and I have altered it, then it otherwise would fit this definition, it wouldn't fit this definition. I hope that's clear what I'm trying to say. So if it was originally manufactured in a given way, and then I altered it, and only by altering it, it fell under this definition, the rest of it, is it then falling under this definition? I hope I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. I'm not clear on the nuance there with original versus.
For sure. So in terms of you're talking about post-manufacturing modifications, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about that original design of the firearm.
Okay. Thank you very much. A few more questions here. Actually, I have a number of them, but so if we're looking, you mentioned not a handgun. So other than rifles and shotguns, why that change? Was there any, other than rifles or shotguns, are there any guns that aren't handguns that it would fall under this that didn't before? Or is that just sort of a semantic change?
I believe the intent is to capture long guns.
All long guns. Okay. All right. Whereas you feel that the shotgun and rifles before didn't quite capture all of them. Can you list a type of firearm long gun that wouldn't have been captured under rifle and shotgun? Can you provide one right now?
Hi. I just wanted to bring a little bit of additional clarification. In the French version, it was fusil de chasse, so that was causing some confusion. So in order to clarify and simplify the definition, I understand that we used a firearm that is other than a handgun to clarify that it does not include shotguns, and that each of these firearms has to meet the defined criteria. And again, the definition is prospective in nature. So if new firearms come in the market, it would have to be assessed against that definition in the future, determining whether or not it would fall under the prohibition.
Okay. So, and I'm going to loop in sort of this secondary clause that's within this, and it's as, at least on the slide deck, I'm going to read from what it was, and I think it's the same in the legislation, but the language, I may need to be corrected, pardon me. But so this is specifically a technical definition. It would cover firearms designed and manufactured after this bill comes into force, and it would not affect the classification of existing firearms in the Canadian market. So I'm not quite understanding what that means. So if let's say I have one of these firearms that falls under this definition, I'm still allowed to own it, use it, sell it, pass it down to my kids, whatever, when this bill passes, if this definition passes with it. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so this is in essence a grandfathering clause. So anyone who owns these right now and buys them up until this passes, if it does, can keep them and use them accordingly and sell them?
So it's different than a grandfathering regime where the classification of the firearm actually changes, and therefore people are permitted to continue to own those firearms. This is the classification of those firearms. It does not change, and therefore they are allowed to use them, possess them, sell them, transfer them with the existing classifications of that firearm.
Okay, so it only impacts so when we say designed and manufactured, does that mean, what if someone is manufacturing an old design? So if they newly mint a gun that falls under this definition otherwise, but is not a new design, because there's obviously many firearms that have, okay, go ahead, sorry.
So think of it a little bit like car manufacturing, is that, somebody, pick your favorite car or truck or vehicle manufacturer, and they're manufacturing an old design, that's not captured. What we're talking about is new designs, new manufacturing.
Okay, so if I'm a car company, and I know this isn't what car companies do, but if I design a 2019 Jetta and sell it in 2013, but it's technically the 2019 model, I'm still allowed to do that? as long as it's not changed in any way, but it's the exact same model as it was 5 years ago?
That would be the government's interpretation, yes.
Okay, so it has to be a newly designed and newly minted. Otherwise, firearms that fall under this definition will continue to be, you can buy one brand new, as long as it's not a new design.
That's correct.
Okay, that's correct. Okay. All right, I have more questions, but I know that others do as well. So we can go to the next speaker for now, Mr. Chair, but I will have follow-up questions.
I feel there will be ample time for you to ask these questions. So we go next to Madame Michaud, followed by Mr. Motz, followed by Ms. Demoff. Madame Michaud.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. And thank you, Ms. Damoff, for having introduced this amendment, which I believe is better than the previous amendment, G4. Obviously, it's not perfect. Will we get a perfect definition of prohibited arms or weapons? I don't think so. But I do have something to say about the expression fusil de chasse that we just referred to. I'm glad that it's been withdrawn from the amendment because it confused folks who thought that their hunting firearm was being directly targeted. And the same goes for the list of firearms that we attempted to reintroduce into the criminal code. It's a good idea that we're withdrawing them. Also, as far as the definition is concerned, the part on the number of joules is being withdrawn. And I'm trying to put my finger on it in the previous definition. Firearms able to shoot a projectile with over 10,000 joules energy in order to neutralize explosive devices. And part F, a diameter superior to 20 millimeters to neutralize explosive devices. I don't know whether the public servants and officials could explain to me why that was withdrawn. Does that change anything for manufacturers when it comes to developing future models? Thank you very much for your question. The 10,000 joule criteria still exists today, and it was included in the Order in Council of the 20th of May 2020, and this was done by regulation and is still in effect today. There's been no change to that. Thank you very much. I also have a question about point 2I, Article 2. Has been developed initially with a detachable cartridge for 6 magazines or more. We are concerned about that insofar as we're afraid that manufacturers might easily be able to circumvent that regulation. For example, a manufacturer might be able to market a weapon with a cartridge that would be limited to 5 magazines, but nothing would prevent them from commercializing that same weapon in the United States, for example, where they'd be able to do so with high-capacity cartridges such as 20 or 30 magazines, and therefore they would filter back into Canada illegally through the black market. And wrongdoers would be able to use those and attach them to a legal weapon here in Canada. So I'm wondering, by including in the definition initially designed to, etc., I don't know if I'm being clear in my remarks here, but does that open the door to circumventing, manufacturers circumventing this definition? Wouldn't it be better off for us to say a cartridge that would have a limited capacity of 6 magazines? I don't know if my question's clear. Response. As far as the choice of language is concerned, it was the government's intention, once again, to target the initial design of the weapon in terms of the cartridge itself. Obviously, the choice of specific wording, is up to the committee ultimately. And this is just the government's proposal. The government's intention is to capture into this notion the design of the cartridge. And I'd also point out that high-capacity cartridges are illegal in Canada. Thank you. I follow you when it comes to the legality of high-capacity cartridges, but there are cartridges that have been modified to reduce the 30 cartridges to one single cartridge, and that remains legal. The government is saying that they are relying on the recommendations on the Commission regarding what occurred in Nova Scotia when it comes to this new definition, by saying that for all intents and purposes it's quite similar. But I've noted a significant difference in the definition proposed by the Commission. There's no use of the expression originally. In English, it's originally designed, à l'origine in French. So is that substantially different in terms of the definition, that addition of originally designed, quote unquote? If it was withdrawn, would that change things for manufacturers when they were trying to comply with that definition?
De notre point de vue,
as far as we're concerned, it's important to capture the intention of the manufacturer in terms of the original design. But perhaps my colleague, Ms. Paquette, would like to tack on to my answer.
Except for the prospective aspect, my understanding is the intent of the new definition. It would capture the same types of firearms that was in the original definition. As for the magazines, this is one element of the definition, so it can't stand alone. It's used to identify what a manufacturer is making. Looking at the magazines as a standalone, there are many firearms that can accept many magazines. So this is just one element to help identify a certain type of firearm.
I'll stop there, Mr. Chairperson, for the time being. Thanks very much.
Merci. Mr. Motz, followed by Ms. DeMoth, followed by Mr. Shipley. Mr. Motz, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I appreciate the responses. So I want to clarify just a couple things that I've heard to date to make sure that we're up to speed. One, that this new definition applies only to firearms that were manufactured, that are going to be manufactured after C-21, should C-21 pass and receive royal assent, then it becomes anything manufactured after that. Is that correct?
it would be after the paragraph comes into force.
After the paragraph comes into force.
That's right.
And when is the paragraph going to come into force?
Royal assent.
Thank you. I didn't think I was losing my mind there for a second. Sorry. It's possible. But the other thing you mentioned, and again, I'm still trying to understand. I guess my mind is going back to existing firearms on the original design, and your definition with original design goes to new firearms. And I think, as Ms. Paquette, you had just indicated, there are many firearms that are manufactured, both have been for decades and could be again in the future, that have the ability to receive different size magazines over the capacity that's legal in Canada. That's correct, right?
Yes.
Okay, so if I'm projecting forward then, so we know that magazine capacity of 5 for these type of firearms, anything over that is prohibited in this country already, correct? Right? So what we're saying then is if there's any firearm that's manufactured after this paragraph becomes royal assent, it receives royal assent, then that firearm should not be capable of receiving a magazine larger than 5. Is that what you're saying?
So there's a difference between the design of the firearm and then the magazine that is, you have to kind of consider those as two different concepts in terms of the capacity of the magazine and how you can convert it according to Canadian regulations. And then the firearm in terms of the design about what it's willing to accept. Those are two separate concepts under the Canadian Criminal Code and the Firearms Act.
Yeah, I'm very aware of that, but I guess what I'm looking for is just for clarity. So right now in Canada, our law allows center-fired long rifles, which when we're talking about here as a firearm that discharges center-fire ammunition in a semi-automatic manner, we're talking about hunting rifles and shotguns. And so when you're looking at this design, you have current firearms right now that are hunting rifles and shotguns that are center fire and accept a magazine that is 5 rounds and can accept a magazine larger than that. However, we all know that larger than that is illegal. The magazine is prohibited. So that device is prohibited, right? So we're basically back to exactly what we have today, that a firearm originally designed with a detachable magazine with a capacity of 6 cartridges or more, it will be prohibited, which is what we have today. Yeah.
Just to add a little bit of clarity, the original design is really looking at the specification of that firearm. So within that original specification of the firearm, the manufacturer, the designer will indicate the intent and what magazines were intended for that firearm. So it could identify a 2 and a 4. It can identify many. Sometimes it'll identify 1. It doesn't mean that there's no other cartridges for that firearm. And this element of the definition is really to look at the intent of the manufacturing of that firearm. So in that specification, was it specified for a 20 round? Regardless of whether it could take a 2 or a 4, what was the intent of the specification? So that's my understanding of the 4th element in that definition.
Okay, I appreciate that response. Those of you who are legal counsel and help write this legislation, is there a way that this could be written to make it any clearer or any cleaner?
So there are various ways of drafting legislation.
Yeah.
We're not the drafters of the legislation. We are in the room and we give instructions. But to say it should or should not be a different way is speculation, and we can't answer that.
No, I'm just wondering whether there's, and I appreciate the response, it's not really what I was asking. I'm asking is, so if this is going to be a point of confusion for manufacturers, potentially, I don't know if it will or not, or firearm owners, because it doesn't apply to firearms that exist on the market today and are in possession of lawful all gun owners today. It only applies to those that are manufactured at some point in the road, down the road, that the Canadians would buy. So again, it may be a question that doesn't really have any impact, but I'm still curious to ensure that the specifications you refer to here are not confusing, and it doesn't cause some of my colleagues around the table who have suggested that the manufacturers might be prone, and I disagree with the assertion, but they're prone to potentially circumvent the law and the rules around the manufacture of firearms. And are you comfortable that this definition will satisfy any confusion that the manufacturers would have?
So the drafting of the provision meets the government's intent in what is proposed to the legislative process, to members of this committee and the Parliament.
Okay. Fair enough. I have just a couple more questions. So again, to review, this does not apply to bolt action or lever action. It's only semi-automatic. It's new designs, new manufacture after this is passed. It does not include any hunting rifle or shotgun that it currently exists on the market today, save, I suspect, all of the guns, the 1,500 or 2,000 that are listed and the order in council of May of 2020. Is that correct?
So all of your questions with regards to, I'll stop all of the ones before the May 2020 OIC. So yes, yes, yes. And then with regards to the May 2020 OIC, there is no change whatsoever that is going to be impacted by this definition. In fact, anything that is on the market today that would meet this definition is not impacted by this definition. There is no change of classification proposed as a result of this definition.
Okay, so I appreciate that answer, but so I'm asking probably an obvious question. The order in council stands as is.
Yes.
Thank you. Those are all my questions for now. Chair, reserve the right to come back.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. Mr. Moff, followed by Mr. Shipley, followed by Ms. Dancho again. Mr. Moff, please go ahead.
I don't need to ask it now, Chair. It was about the order in council, and Mr. Motz actually asked it.
Very well. We go now to Mr. Shipley.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to everyone for being back again here. We're talking about C21. What a pleasure. I have to start off with making some comments about my colleague across the table, Ms. Damoff's opening remarks. Ms. Damoff, we've had a nice working relationship, I believe, up till now, and I don't think I'm an ultra-partisan guy. But some of your remarks, quite frankly, to use a bad analogy, you kind of took a fully automatic weapon and mowed us all down with your opening remarks, said, but all your conservative colleagues across the table spreading misinformation. I take offense to that. Disinformation, dismiss, I don't know, that's all you guys ever use, those two words. I mentioned it many times. If you could show me an example where I've even spoke about this since you've brought up these new amendments, we can have that discussion. But I haven't. So you can't blanket everyone. And I'm not sure what my colleagues have said or not said, and I don't think we've all said misinformation, disinformation. We need to start, we're starting off today. We got a lot of long work ahead of us. To have the very opening remarks be so partisan, I find it a little bit objective, Ms. Damoff. And I don't think that was really a great way to start this tone as to where we were heading on this. So I just wanted to clear that. And you mentioned that you've been on this committee since 2015 and how your residents have called on you to enforce stricter, I don't want to paraphrase, but I think you said stricter gun regulations. And it's your party that's been in power for 8 years. I mean, you've had 8 years to correct things. I'm hearing day in and day out, not just from my residents, that things have gotten a lot worse in 8 years. So now to sit here today and make it sound like you've done so much over 8 years, it's gotten worse across Canada as far as I'm concerned, and the stats I think go to show that. So I'm sorry to have to start off, making this about you and I having a discussion, but you kind of started it, Ms. Damoff, and I just took offense to some of your comments, and I wanted to feel a little better by getting them off my chest. So what I really want to talk about with this new amendment is the fact that I hope, maybe we can all agree that the original G4 was a problem, was probably written poorly, caused some issues, and I know there's been a lot of time for your party to go back, and there was some consultations done by your minister. I'm sure you guys have had lots of meetings about this. To now see this new clause that's come out, quite frankly, it's just so vague. It's just so poorly written. Clause 2, specifically, from someone who's been in design of product for over 25 years, to word something that says was originally designed with a detachable cartridge magazine with a capacity of 6 cartridges or more, that's so vague. You could drive a dump truck through that wording. You've had this long to come up with what you are really trying to do, and that's the best wording. I think some of my other colleagues have mentioned it too. It doesn't even make sense. I mean, originally what? Is that from a CAD design? Is that from when someone originally started the first plans? I mean, it's just vague. It just really doesn't make any sense. So I guess I could ask the staff that are here today. My colleague, Mr. Mott's, kind of touched on most of the questions I had about that second one, but I mean, I have no idea what originally designed means. That could mean just about anything. Does anybody want to jump in here and tell me how they can possibly say what original design means?
So I think the intent of using originally designed is so that it doesn't capture the aftermarket magazines. Because there could be firearms, right, that are not originally designed with a certain magazine, but then there could be a magazine that comes out in future years that also fits that firearm, or that is made for that firearm. So it's the word originally is so that you don't start capturing those aftermarket magazines.
Well, agree, but again, and I'm not here to nitpick this apart because, I don't want to do the job for the government and correct their legislation on this one, but, I mean, originally designed, you could have two sets of CAD designs going through an operation at the same time. One's dated 5 minutes before the other one, that's the original design. It just doesn't make sense. So that's what I'm trying to say. I understand what you're saying with the aftermarket, but original design, 5 minutes later is not the original design, it's the new design. So I'll leave it at that for now. I know some of my other colleagues have some comments. We'll see where this goes. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Shipley. We go now to Ms. Dancho, followed by Mr. Ruff, followed by Mr. Julian. Ms. Dancho, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple things. So on this definition, so just so I'm clear, now police have to enforce this. So again, it's been outlined that, and officials have clarified, but I'm struggling to understand how a police officer would enforce this, assuming that the Liberal government, after 3 years, does eventually get its confiscation regime going, and a number of these firearms are apprehended. I'm not clear how an officer is supposed to know if something was newly manufactured. I mean, going back to the car analogy, sometimes a 2022 model and a 2021 model are only a little bit different. So has there been any thought or discussion with police of how they would determine if a firearm is prohibited? How are they supposed to know that one is newly designed after this comes into force? Can you elaborate at all, or perhaps it's too abstract, but I'm just not clear how this is actually enforceable.
So if the definition and this legislation were to pass and it were to come into force, then our colleagues at the Canadian Firearms Program would be updating, as new designs come into market, they would be updating the FRT, and law enforcement relies on the FRT, the Firearms Reference Table.
Oh, I see. So they wouldn't be, so if a manufacturer or someone orders one from the U.S., it would be stopped. The FRT would stop it from coming in or would prohibit it from being sold legally. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So it's up to the FRT basically to know these differences if something is newly designed versus an older version. The FRT has that responsibility. Is that correct?
So the FRT is not a person, or it's a table, it's a thing.
Right.
So,
but the people who are responsible for the FRT, I suppose.
Yes, the Canadian Firearms
Which
Program.
is the RCMP, is it not?
That's right, and colleagues at the Canadian Firearms Program.
Okay. But is that not the case right now? Then, I mean, with prohibited firearms, using the FRT, the RCMP does not allow the sale of prohibited models of firearms right now. Is that correct?
So there is, yes, that is correct. When the information is captured within the firearms reference table, but currently not all firearms in Canada are captured in the firearms reference table. But when they are, yes, we use the specifications to update and create a record.
Why are all not captured right now? Is it sort of, it gets into market and then it's added to the FRT, or?
It's based on the classification regime. Currently, we don't have registration for non-restricted firearms. So when that registration was removed for non-restricted firearms, there was no mechanism for the consistency of updating the firearms reference table. So you will find that we're behind in some of the non-restricted firearms as we see them out in businesses. We update, we go to trade shows to try to see what new firearms are entering the market, but it is possible that we do not have all of the firearms within Canada in the FRT.
specifically, though, only non-restricted.
The ones that were
Restricted would be, right?
well, there are some instances where there have been some mistakes where businesses have thought, based on the definition in the criminal code, that the firearm met a non-restricted definition, but after our review, they either were linked to an OIC or there was just some errors in that, and they actually were restricted or prohibited firearms.
Thank you. So you mentioned there was a few instances, or sorry, I think I'm putting words. Did you say a few or many? Does this happen often, or is this like a one-off situation? This has happened.
It's very difficult to determine. I know last time we were asked for statistics around that as well, but because there's no mechanism to force the updating or the for the businesses to identify to us what firearms are coming into Canada, specifically the non-restricted, I can't say how many errors there are.
Ms. Dancho? I think Ms. Dancho has
Sorry,
technical
can
issues.
you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Can you? Oh, okay, I don't know what's happened there. Sorry, my connection's unstable. Please let me know if that happens again. Okay, so I think I'm clear on that. One thing I did want to understand better is the minister in his announcement of this yesterday mentioned that he will also require the permanent alteration of long gun magazines, so they can never hold more than 5 rounds, and he will ban the sale or transfer of magazines
Point of order.
of holding.
Sorry, Raquel, your sound is very strange. I just wanted to check with the clerk to make sure the interpreters are still okay, because it's cutting, on my anyway, it's cutting in and out.
Thanks. Just, check with the interpreters, Mr. Clerk, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, my internet connection is strong again, so it should be okay. I'm using the updated headset.
No blizzards in Manitoba today?
You know, it's a sunny, beautiful day. I wish I was outside, actually. Okay.
We're good?
How is that now? Is that better?
I think it's good, so let's carry on.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, my question is, I'm not clear if this definition, if I'm not understanding this definition fully, because the minister did mention when he was announcing this yesterday about a large capacity magazines. And I'm just wondering if this is somewhere in this definition, and just to be clear, what was provided to, I believe it was MPs and media and the others, it was that he will require the permanent alteration of long gun magazines so they can never hold more than 5 rounds, and ban the sale or transfer of magazines capable of holding more than the legal number of bullets. So is that in this somewhere, or am I not seeing, where is that mentioned in these amendments? Or is it in future ones that we can't talk about yet, or can we get an answer on that?
Thank you. So that part of the minister's announcement, and I would refer you back to the news release, is outside of the bill. These are other measures that the government would bring forward, intends to bring forward, and that's outside of the scope of this bill.
Okay. But I'm just not clear about, so that doesn't fall under this definition then. But if we're talking about permanently altering, which is the verbiage, that exists right now for 5 rounds. Magazines they have to be pinned, so to speak, at 5 rounds. And the language used right now in legislation is permanently altered. So can you tell us if that's different now because of this in regulation?
So again, this is outside of the scope of this bill, and I would just refer you back to the minister's announcement.
Okay. The reason I ask is because it was announced sort of when he was talking about C21. So he's announcing there's a new definition, no list, also announcing this, getting a lot of questions about this. I believe that the officials at the table right now are those who would be supporting those new regulations regarding magazine capacity. Can we have answers on those specifics, or how is it that we get answers on what that means? Because it is all involved in this conversation as per the minister's announcement, and
I would suggest that perhaps officials might not be able to speak to what might be forthcoming in other matters. I don't know. But it's kind of out of the scope of this amendment in any event. So the officials may answer if they wish, but go ahead.
Sure. The regulations that are underneath the criminal code or within the criminal code, those we cannot speculate on timing or what would be included, but we can refer to both, as my colleague has said, the Minister of Public Safety's news release yesterday, as well as the government commitments to permanently alter large capacity magazines. And that's about all we would be able to provide the committee today.
Okay. Does that include tubular magazines when he says that?
I have the wording of the commitment before me, if you'd like me to read it. The mandate commitment is requiring the permanent alteration of long gun magazines so they can never hold more than 5 rounds, and banning the sale or transfer of magazines capable of holding more than the legal number of bullets. And those were the commitments made by the government on December 16th, 2021. With respect to large capacity magazines. And again, anything in future regulations would be confidential, and we don't have any information about the timing and the scope of those regulations at this time.
Okay, I will move on to other questions, but I just have serious concerns, Mr. Chair, regarding this, because if it includes tubular magazines, that includes things like the Winchester lever action, which is a very old Woodstock classic gun used by farmers and hunters. That very much is Grandpa Joe's hunting rifle. So is the Lee Enfield gun. That is also Grandpa Joe's hunting rifle. So I'm just very concerned that we don't have clarity on this. He announced it within the scope of the C-21 amendment. So if we can't get more clarity, I'm very concerned that we're not going to be able to answer the many questions we're receiving. A lot of people have tubular magazine long guns, and the Lee Enfield is about as ubiquitous as the SKS.
I would suggest that these concerns are, while valid, are beyond the scope of this amendment. This is strictly a definition. It doesn't relate to magazines. Really, it doesn't make it doesn't relate to any existing firearm, as what we've heard. So anyway, carry on if you wish.
Yes, thank you. I would just ask perhaps Ms. Demoff, as Parliament Secretary, we talked about this offside, but that the government consider a technical briefing on that specifically, because there are a tremendous amount of questions from industry and firearm owners about this. So it is a growing concern. So perhaps we can have that conversation offside. Okay, that's all for me for now, but I may have more, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Dancho. We go now to Mr. Ruff, followed by Mr. Julian, followed by Mr. Motz. Mr. Ruff, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I got a couple things. It is more for the Parliamentary Secretary, so I don't mess up her name. In your opening remarks, you made a couple of caveats or comments. The majority of Canadians support this definition. You talked about the consultation process. So 2 questions really for her is, how do you know this? Do we have any data or evidence that the majority of Canadians, like, could we get that tabled here so we understand where that evidence is? And again, across Canada, it's something I did ask the minister privately or one-on-one last Friday, I believe it was, when I was here at committee, because the consultation process that he's taken since the previous G4 was tabled, he said he went wide and across the country. And do we have could we get the government to provide the committee a list of where he went, who he saw? Because I'm not aware of him having visited one Conservative riding. So again, I don't want to be partisan here. I'm just trying to understand if we're only getting the consultations only impacting some Canadians. So that's my first question for the Parliamentary Secretary, tied to, what the logic behind this amendment.
Members of the committee aren't here to answer questions. They might be able to. She may answer if she wishes, but you might want to respond or ask the officials these questions.
Well, I can ask the officials if they have the information. If she doesn't want to answer.
Well, she may if she wishes,
No, that's
but
fine.
it's,
Just- it's a
it's
straightforward,
really
friendly
not,
question.
it's
I
not
get
the
it.
role of the members of the committee to provide evidence to the committee, right?
No? I'll ask the officials, maybe public safety or with the firearms program, because obviously that's where some of this was built from, is do we have a list of all the different places the minister went and who he consulted with over the last number of months?
I would invite you to pose that question to the minister.
Well, I could ask them. All right, so you don't have that information?
Not with me, no.
All right, I guess tied to this with the consultation of this definition to the officials that helped drafted this was were manufacturers consulted at all?
So there were broad discussions, engagements that were done. Again, I'm here to support the review of the motion and the bill. I'm not here, so I would invite you again to pose those questions to the minister.
All right.
Mr. Ruff, Ms. DeMoff will respond if you wish.
Thank you.
So first off, the question should be directed to the minister, not to me. I'm not here to answer questions, but you asked where does it come from? Every poll that I've ever seen. So I'll quote you one. Ipsos did a poll, 8 and 10, 82% Canadians support federal government's ban on military-style assault weapons, done on the 28th of May, 2020. It's available on their website, so you can check that. And I'll just leave it at that. It's public polling, so it's available for anyone who wants to look for it.
Just to get that, you said 2020?
That's one that I have found. It's been consistent, though, Mr. Ruff.
So that's fine.
It has been consistent for years. You asked if there was actually polling that was done. I've given you one. You can take a look, and I would suspect the numbers have not changed very much from 2020 to 2023.
My question was around this definition. We're talking about this definition. Military-style assault rifles is not this definition. This is redefining what a prohibited firearm is. The definition specifically speaks to what was discussed and brought forward under G4, now withdrawn, rightfully so. We now have a new definition for a prohibited firearm based on, as the minister announced yesterday, and as these amendments that were moved today by yourself, and I'm just asking for the consultation and because that's exactly what you stated. So that's fine. We don't have it. I just sort of wanted to get that clarified, and specifically back to the officials. If I heard correctly, there's no, from understanding from the officials' perspective, manufacturers themselves. I'm trying to. They're the ones that are directly impacted by this, because this is a new definition, an amendment going forward for future firearms, not historical firearms. So therefore, I'm just trying to understand that whether or not they were consulted, because they're the ones that are ultimately, we have firearms manufacturers, and again, they're not bad people. They're just producing a tool for hunters and sport shooters, et cetera. And just trying to seek the clarity there of whether or not they were involved at all in the consultation process of this, coming up with this definition.
So I would refer you back to the announcement yesterday, which talked about the announcement follows engagement with Canadians across the country, and it lists the different types of groups and stakeholders that were engaged with during the consultation, during the intervening period.
All right, I'll leave that at that, Chair. To go just again, some of the questions, I mean, Ms. Dancho did a great analogy of talking about vehicles, but again, I'm just concerned about going forward. So if we take, for example, say the Browning hunting rifle Mark II or Mark III that was caught up under the previous G4 is no longer caught up in this, but if it was to be remanufactured to the same specs in the future, right? So the Browning produces more of these hunting rifles. They will not be captured under this, because they were originally, no matter what they were designed for, how they were originally designed for, tied to magazine capacity, historically, they're not part of this. This is just for future firearms only.
That's correct.
Thank you. That's it. I have now, Mr. Chair. I would request maybe a quick recess for a break for the members here. I know we'd like to have a quick huddle and maybe a bathroom break. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Well, I certainly support that. Is it okay for the committee to take a 10-minute break? Okay. We are suspended for 10 minutes. Hope we all had a nice chat and a little lunch. I know I did, at least the lunch part. And Ickwinder, I apologize. I hadn't realized you're vegetarian. We will address that in future occasions.
Sure, it's just that it's just that my other committee, has like a full spread, and then I came to this committee maybe 2 months ago, so it's fine.
We may have to be brought up to speed, to measure up to the other committees. Yeah, no worries. Okay, thank you all. So we are engaged in debate on G 3.2. The floor is now to Mr. Julian, followed by Mr. Motz, followed by Ms. Dancho.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. I've been here a while. I'm new to this committee, but I've certainly been at Parliament Hill for a while. I was through Parliament through the years of Mr. Harper's government. And certainly at committee, we would often receive amendments even the same day. I appreciate that this time we've had 24 hours to digest the amendments, and we've had time to question and appreciate our witnesses here to get answers. Now, we have spent well over an hour on one amendment to start. At that rhythm, I'm concerned with the 145 amendments that we have, that would take us through on the basis of what Ms. Dancho said at the beginning of this meeting, that the Conservatives would agree to the normal committee schedule of 4 hours a week, maybe making up occasionally for a day when Parliament does not sit, for example, with the Liberal Convention this weekend and the Bloc Convention in 2 weeks. But 145 hours and 4 hours a week, that takes us through literally to October 2024, not October 2023, October 2024. I'm concerned about that because I hope this is not a filibuster. I see some indications that it is. Some questions that are repetitive, some questions that are rhetorical, and some debating that has nothing to do with the bill. And that concerns me because we did manage to adopt one amendment a long time ago this evening, it seems, that deals with ghost guns. And we know that in some parts of the country, the prevalence of ghost guns has increased 1,000% over the past year. That's 100% a month, Mr. Chair. So a delay of a month or 2 or 18 months, if we're continuing at the same rhythm, is something that is, to my mind, very, very concerning. I take it on good faith that this is not a filibuster. I certainly hope it is not. I see many signs that indicate to me that it may well be. I certainly believe we all have time to consider the amendments. We've had time to question the witnesses as well and get answers to those questions, and I think those answers have been very clear. So I'll express my concern, Mr. Chair, that if there is a need to advance on this, I do understand and I agree with Ms. Dancho that the delay we've had over the last few months was caused by the government tabling amendments that had not been appropriately vetted. That is true, but two wrongs don't make a right. And if the Conservatives are then delaying things in an unduly, in my mind, in a way that means that we can't get to the important amendments and work through them in a forthright way, I'm concerned that we're delaying this bill even longer at a time when the ghost gun provisions are urgently needed by law enforcement, and they have called for it urgently for law enforcement. So I wanted to raise that concern. As I mentioned, this amendment is very clear to me, and I'll be voting in favor of it. I wanted to flag two things. One, that I'm beginning to sense that there is a filibuster, and I hope I'm wrong. Secondly, though, Mr. Chair, I think the idea that we would be restricted to just doing the normal committee schedule of 4 hours a week at the rhythm that we're going right now in terms of amendments, that simply won't allow the effective consideration and moving forward with this bill that's required. So I wanted to express my misgivings through you, Mr. Chair, to the committee, and hopefully we will start moving forward on these things. And I, through you, want to express my appreciation to the witnesses. They've given very fulsome, very complete, very clear answers. And so I think we should take those answers and, as a committee, be effective in moving forward on this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. If it's any help, I think this is a really significant amendment, and hopefully we don't need to extrapolate this amendment into all of them. That being said, of course, as we go forward, as things develop, we will do what we need to do. So we go next to Mr. Motz. Mr. Motz, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. To Mr. Julian's point, and to yours that you just made, your intervention, I would agree. I would think that because of the importance of this particular definition and the impact on this bill and the impact on law-abiding firearms owners in this country and manufacturers, the entire industry, if you will, this is something that we have to, go through with some vigor and discuss all aspects and understand it completely. So the suggestion that because we're taking a long time on this particular amendment, that this is how it will be all the time is simply untrue. And I think we can be quite judicious on some of the other amendments moving forward. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, I was hopeful that there would be some time to further digest this bill, or this definition, sorry, but it doesn't appear as if there's any willingness to do that by some of the other parties. So I will go back to something that I started with C-21 when we first began our debate back in the fall. And that has to do with scope. I've had conversations with many people on both sides of the aisle since C-21 was introduced. And, there is some, the C-21 was introduced as a handgun bill. It was debated in the House of Commons as a handgun bill. And yet, the majority of our debates at this particular committee, since the new definitions have come out, have to do with long guns and shotguns, and are completely out of scope. And if I understand parliamentary process, that it would be reasonable to have the expansion of this scope go back to the House to be determined of whether it is in scope, or that the government decides to put something forward that it could be debated in the House and then brought back here to committee, that we can continue to have this conversation. And in fact, that may be something that the government should consider, that this definition and the new additions to this bill actually do get brought back to the House for debate. Now, unfortunately, I think I tried to do this last time on a motion. You ruled it to be in order or within scope, and I disagreed, and some horsepower in the House disagree with you as well. And, that's still an opportunity that exists. So, I think it behooves us as a committee to, Canadians heard us in the House debate this bill about handguns. Now, for the last 6 months or so, we've been talking about long guns and shotguns and hunting rifles and things that impact a wider range of Canadians than the handgun freeze or handgun ban, and a buyback process and things like that. And now we're involving the livelihood of Canadians to and pastime of Canadians and sustenance for Canadians that are now impacted by this particular bill. So my suggestion is that we give some consideration to the fact that that this bill, this definition and some of the amendments to this bill are out of scope, and that would be a motion that I would present to this committee, that it be sent back to the House to determine whether or not it is in scope, and have the Speaker make that ruling.
So I had not ruled specifically on this motion, on this amendment in this meeting. However, I've heard arguments on both sides of this question over the months, over the days, over the months. I'm inclined to maintain consistency with the previous decision, that it is in scope, and carry on from there. If the House feels it is not in scope later on, it may happen in due course that the House address that issue, and I'm certainly look forward to that if that issue, should that be required. But at the moment, I will rule that the matter is in scope at this time.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
On a point of order, Mr. Chairperson. Regarding what you just said, what would that mean if we were to do clause-by-clause consideration of the bill, that we finish the study and then the Speaker of the House says that it's out of scope in relation to the bill? What would occur at that point, if you could help me understand?
We're a little out of my area, but Mr. Julian might be able to respond to that. My belief is that before that should happen, the House would take action. And the House leaders have considered this, and they will take action to bring it into scope explicitly. Failing that, I think that if it is not done in due course, that when we report back to the House, that such elements as the Speaker might feel are not in scope, as at the time the bill comes back to the House, he could set them aside, possibly have them brought forward at report stage. Explicitly, I don't know, but I will defer to Mr. Julian if you wish to respond to this.
Oh, I'll defer to you, Mr. Chair, because you're absolutely right, and Mr. Motz is right as well. Ultimately, confirmation of scope comes from the House, and so that is something that the House can choose to do. If not, if the House has not confirmed that, the Speaker is the one who is governed to make that decision, and that was certainly the trajectory we were taking, I think, a few months ago with the amendments. Your interpretation of this being in scope, I completely agree with. But ultimately, if there's any party questions that, the House confirming scope is an important step to take.
And if I may, Chair, thank you, Mr. Julian, for that. I go back to Ms. Michaud's question, and that is, so hypothetically, if we continue on, given your ruling, and we continue to move down this path, and then we find out in the weeks ahead that the House and/or the Speaker, or both, confirm that it's out of scope, what does that do to these amendments? What does that do to our discussion? What does that do to the bill? Those are legitimate questions that we have to have answered before we decide to move forward.
All fair points. The Speaker will not rule on this matter until the bill is returned to the House. The Speaker regards what happens in committee to be a matter for the committee to determine. Once the bill is complete and we report it back to the House, then if there are concerns about scope, those need to be raised with the Speaker in the House, and the Speaker would deal with them appropriately. What appropriately means, I think, if he felt that at that time there were aspects that we passed that were in fact out of scope in his view, I believe he would back out those provisions. he might require them to be voted on at second, explicitly at report stage. Mr. Julian, go ahead.
You're right, Mr. Chair. We saw this under the Harper government, I believe, a number of times, where ultimately the House confirmed the scope of bills while the committee was working through amendments. I'm certainly hoping it's not going to take us 18 months to work through the amendments, which is the schedule we've sort of set up today, but I hope to be profoundly wrong in this regard. So that being said, the Speaker would not rule until there is a committee report when we have finalized the clause-by-clause amendments. The House can choose during that period to confirm scope. So I think it's a bit of a premature, it's an important discussion, a bit premature, because we have just started clause by clause again, and we've got, according to my schedule, a heck of a lot of hours to go. But the Speaker's ruling would only take place after we report, as you've pointed out, Mr. Chair, and the House can choose in the meantime to confirm scope, which I think is quite possibly a very likely outcome.
I have been advised by the legislative clerk here, who has done phenomenal work in taking these amendments that came in yesterday and over the last few days and putting them together, so thank you for that. Anyway, in terms of my thoughts that if they were felt to be out of scope by the Speaker, that they could be dealt with at report stage, that's not the case. They would just be pulled from the bill at that time. Okay? Any further discussion on this point? Mr. Motz, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I apologize. We'll go to actually Mr. Moff on this point, followed by Madame Michaud.
Mr. Chair, I've been on the speaking list for quite some time. I thought that I was after Mr. Motz.
You certainly are. I thought in terms of the amendment, I was thinking we're dealing with this particular sort of subtopic, if you will. If you wish to respond now to Mr. Motz's comments instead, or in advance, after Ms. Gamoff and Madame Michaud, presumably we'll get back to discussion of the, and actually Mr. Motz again, we will presumably get back to the amendment itself. And did you wish to respond now or wait until that time?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have a few clarifying questions left, not too many, but a few. I did want to address a few of the things that have been said, certainly regarding a filibuster. I think any suggestion that asking an hour worth of questions to what in its previous iteration was the largest hunting rifle ban in Canadian history is kind of silly. This is what the committee is for. This was just dropped yesterday. We're trying to understand what this is. It's very odd. I know it's not technically a grandfathering clause, but I'm trying to understand what the magnitude of this is, because the last version of this was extremely serious and impacted the 2.3 million gun owners in this country and caused a countrywide uproar and mobilization of hunters, farmers, and sports shooters, Indigenous Canadians that we've never seen. So taking an hour, maybe two, maybe a few more, I don't know, to get perfect clarity on what exactly this means and the impact it's going to have, we're going to make sure that we get that clarity. And I'll note that the first amendment we went through before this went forward in relatively short and peaceful orders. My expectation that most of the amendments, assuming there's no curveballs that we don't know about yet, we'll proceed in a very.
Madame Dancho, I think we've lost your audio. The clerk advises me that your audio, your connection is very intermittent. So we did miss the last part of what you said.
Okay. So I'm wrapping up that point. Is that fine? Okay. So I did want to also note that the last time we had this amendment, which had a very similar definition, in fact, it was almost the same. We originally called a vote to rule it out of scope. The NDP voted against it, but then in the House, the NDP most recently tried to rule it out of scope themselves.
On a point of order, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, I've lost interpretation into French. The sound quality does not allow for simultaneous interpretation.
Guys, colleagues, I don't know why this is happening. My internet connection is fine. I have all the latest tech. So, how is it now?
Speak a little bit more, and we'll see if the.
Okay, I will try to speak slowly. Just also not clear on the scope. The NDP did move, tried to move a motion in the House, ruling the last iteration, which was very similar, out of scope. So I'm not clear why their perspective has changed. Perhaps they would like to add some clarity. The definition is largely the same. That they believed was out of scope.
I'm sorry, the quality of your sound is inadequate for interpretation. But I would say, in response, if I may, that this is not the same motion, sorry, the same amendment. It is strictly forward-looking. It incorporates. It's strictly forward-looking is the bottom line, and incorporates.
Mr. Chair, the definition of what they're looking to ban forward-looking is the same.
Point of order. Two things. One, Ms. Dancho is not getting interpretation, but I have a question. Has someone challenged the chair's decision? Because if not, we should just go back to the clause that I've introduced. So if there's no challenge of the chair, which I haven't actually heard yet, then we should just get back to clause by clause and on the amendment. And I'm sorry that someone can't participate virtually, but if the interpretation is not coming through, we can't just continue to take part. So if there's no challenge to the chair, then we should just move on, Chair.
I think it's okay, Mr. Chair. Is the interpretation still not coming through?
I think it's very sporadic. Your connection is.
I will log off and restart my computer program. I hope in good faith colleagues don't pull any shenanigans in the few minutes that I'm gone. Thank you.
We'll do our best. Meanwhile, let us go to Madame Demoff. Did you wish to carry on with the?
It was just a question. Okay. If we should continue on with the amendment that I put on the floor, if there's no challenge to the chair's decision, and if there is a challenge to the chair, then it's non-debatable and we just vote on it. So let's just. I haven't heard that it has been, so let's just carry on with the amendment.
Madame Michaud, you were next, followed by Mr. Motz. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Please proceed. If I could just add some clarification to what Mr. Motz said and Mr. Julian said. They said it was premature to think about an eventual decision by the Speaker of the House once the bill does arrive in the House. That's curious because the government has G4 and G46, and the New Democrats are about to table a motion such that the Speaker of the House would hand down a decision about the scope of the bill. So it's a bit curious to hear that at this stage of the game. And as Ms. Damoff just said, were there to be your decision to be challenged, Mr. Chair, well, then perhaps it would behoove us to vote on this immediately. Otherwise, I'd be prepared to return to the debate on the amendment.
Mr. Motz, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to add some clarity to my motion, I'll put it this way. I move that the committee report the following to the House, that notwithstanding the usual practices of the House, the committee requests for the Speaker to provide a ruling as soon as possible on the admissibility of Amendment
we have
3.2 in relation to the scope
We have
of
a
Bill C-21.
motion on the floor. We can't move another motion at this time.
I'm amending my own motion.
Your motion is not on the floor. Ms. DeMoss' motion is
My
on the floor.
motion was still on the floor. I said I moved to determine whether this is in
You
scope.
can't move a motion while there's a motion in progress. If you wish to challenge the decision of the chair, that's different. I think it's privileged, and it would proceed without further debate.
Right,
but you cannot move another motion at this time.
Right, and we will wait until Ms. Dancho is back online.
Absolutely. Okay. So it is your intention to challenge the chair. Okay. We will wait for Ms. Dancho. Welcome back. In your absence, Mr. Mott has challenged the chair. The question, therefore, is as follows. Shall the decision of the chair that this amendment is in scope be sustained? I'll ask for a recorded division. And
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
On a point of order, I do have a question before we vote, if time permits, just for the legislative clerk, if I may.
Is it a question on this vote? itself, a question? Okay, we'll pause for a minute for the question if you like, but no debate. This is not debatable.
Non, juste une question.
No, just a question for the legislative clerk. Now, were the government hypothetically to move a motion to broaden the scope of the bill, at what point could they do so? Would they do so before coming back with amendments that would go beyond the scope of the bill? For example, an amendment on assault-style weapons. Would they do that before retabling them, or could they do it at any point until the bill returns to the House after clause-by-clause consideration?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. C'est difficile de...
Well, it's difficult to respond to your question, Ms. Michaud. There are several avenues at their disposal. I don't have the text of the motion in question in front of me. There are a number of avenues. The committee could move a motion to broaden the scope of the bill, report to the House, and once the report is adopted by the House, there'd be an order from the House such that the committee could indeed study the amendment that would be out of scope initially. That's the first option. The other option is for the government, or anyone for that matter, to move a motion in the House that would propose the same thing that would be debated during routine proceedings. So it's either of those two options. Would it be at any time between now and the end of clause-by-clause consideration, or would it be before those motions? Well, response. Again, it depends on the text of the motion. What will the motion entail? The motion as such, well, I don't have it right here, so it's difficult to say. Generally speaking, that kind of motion comes before moving amendments so that the scope of the bill can be broadened immediately and then consider the amendments after the fact. A retroactive motion, well, if that's what you're intending to entertaining, well, how would that work? Well, that would depend on the wording of the motion itself. So it's a bit tough to respond to your question in absolute terms. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so the question is, shall the decision of the chair be upheld, be sustained? If you vote yes, you are voting to sustain the decision of the chair. If you vote no, you're voting to set it aside, and a tie goes to the chair, basically. So I'll ask Mr. Clarke to do a voice vote, and Ms. Dancho, if there becomes a problem with sound, you can do the thumb up, thumb down thing. Okay, Mr. Clarke, please go ahead.
Mr. Chang? Yes. Ms. Damoff?
So by voting yes, I'm saying that I support his decision, correct? Yeah, yes.
Mr. Gahir?
Yes.
Mr. Noor Mohammed?
Yes.
Mr. Shifki?
Oui.
Ms. Dancho?
Sorry, just to be clear, if I vote no, that means I leave this out of scope, in essence. Is that correct?
Yes.
Sorry,
Yes.
I'm not in the room, so yes. Okay, so I vote against, Mr. Chair, respectfully.
Mr. Ruff?
Nay.
Mr. Mutz?
No.
Mr. Shipley?
No.
Madame Michaud?
Oui.
Mr. Julian?
Yes, we.
So 6, 4 in favor, 4 against.
Thank you all. The decision of the chair is upheld. So as far as we are concerned in this committee, until it gets back to the House, it is in scope. And so I have on my list, I have Madame Michaud, followed by Mr. Motz. Did you want, with this? Okay, Mr. Motz, I believe.
Sorry, point of order, Mr. Chair. Just for the benefit of everyone that is here and in the room and for the staff, what time, are we going to go till 6:30 or is there intention to keep going beyond that time?
We have until 7.
7, okay.
And although I understand it's a hockey game that starts around 7, so we might want to, see how we go. You pass this bill straight away. We'll get you to the hockey game. Ms. Dench, Mr. Motz, followed by Ms. Dancho.
Chair, I move that the committee report the following to the House. That notwithstanding the usual practices of the House,
Mr.
the committee
Motz,
requests to the Speaker.
We cannot have a motion at this time. We are engaged in a motion, Ms. DeMoff's motion, right? So until we finish this motion, we can't entertain another motion. Okay? So, did you have any further remarks on this motion? Ms. Dancho, please go ahead. And if we get a problem with sound, you may have to, in my experience, cutting off your video might help. Let's see how it goes.
Okay, please let me know. And again, I apologize, colleagues, for it's not happened to me really before. So, okay, couple questions that are kind of a big question, I suppose, on this amendment, just to be clear of what our caution is with this. Liberals, particularly the minister, in his announcement, made it very clear that he's looking to ban what he has dubbed so-called assault weapons, this term that the government is trying to establish in this definition. He has said that these are designed for the battlefield and unsafe for public use, which is what Ms. DeMoff alluded to in her remarks as well. So making these all sound very scary, of course, conservatives and many firearms owners take issue with this, as we found in G4 and G46, many commonly used firearms used for hunting were encompassed in what they were calling assault style. That was made very clear. So our caution is, if this amendment is being brought forward, the definition is what they want to describe now is what they've been calling assault style. This is now their definition. And as I said, they're so dangerous. Why is there this sort of, it's not grandfathering, but I've been calling it, for lack of a better word, forward-looking clause, we'll call it, Mr. Chair. If liberals are saying they're too dangerous for public use, which of course we disagree with, firearms owners disagree with, but if they're saying that, why are they letting people keep them and having a forward-looking clause? That's what we're not understanding. That's why we feel like there's something else going on here that we're not clear on, given the arguments that have been made for the last number of months and years from liberals. So I'm not sure, I feel like that perhaps is more of a political question, but so I don't mean to put the officials on the spot, but that is our hesitation here because of what was established in the last amendments and what the argument continues to be, including for this amendment that the minister made yesterday, saying that battlefield guns, assault weapons, all these slogans and words that he's been using. So again, if they're so dangerous, why are you letting people keep them? Perhaps Ms. DeMoff can explain, and then perhaps we won't feel so cautious and understand that this is really what it is. You're letting everybody keep these. Is that what we're seeing here? So and I just have one follow-up and then I'll be done.
So it's, if you're asking questions of Ms. DeMoff, I mean, she's not here to answer questions. She's a member of the committee.
Okay.
She may engage in the debate as she wishes, and you may certainly ask questions of the officials.
Sure. I'm not trying to put her on the spot. I'm just trying to explain why we're being very cautious about this, because it really doesn't make sense, Mr. Chair. I think that's obvious, given the rhetoric that we've heard from the Liberal government.
I think that's really a matter of what we're debating right now. So anyway, if you wish to come back at this, we'll go next to Mr. Mohammed.
No, I'm not quite finished.
Okay.
I'm not finished.
Okay,
Mr.
go
Chair.
ahead. Go ahead.
Please. I did want to note that there has been no consultations through this committee process on this forward-looking clause. Had there been, we may have got more clarity on what exactly this means. Again, it seems that there's a trick being pulled here a little bit, because it just doesn't add up at all. And there was no consultations done on this. And so when we were at G4 and G46, the government conceded, because they were so significant in the largest hunting rifle ban in history, that we were going to have 8 consultation meetings as a result. But now here we have a new definition, Mr. Chair, and no consultation on that the committee gets to do. It just seems very strange. And the NDP did view this as out of scope before, and the bloc was sort of open to that. So it just is odd that we needed so much consultation on the prior one, and now we have a new one, and yet we're not allowed to consult, and we're being criticized for asking an hour worth of questions on something that may be very significant. Just not really clear on that. Secondly, I appreciate that Ms. DeMoff mentioned a poll, but the government's own consultation, when I asked for freedom or an information request, on public consultations on C21, they provided us information on a $200,000 consultation. And of the 133,369 people who were consulted through that consultation, 77% of them responded said that nothing more was needed to limit access to so-called assault weapons. 81% said no to limiting more access to handguns. So this was $200,000 and almost 200,000 people consulted, and the evidence was quite clear from their response. So it doesn't really add up with that one poll that probably polled about 1,500 people, maybe 400 even. So just to be clear, the government's own evidence was not in favor of this from a public opinion side. And lastly on that, Mr. Chair, we know when the government says assault style, they really mean hunting rifles. That was established in G4 and G46, which was why the government seemed to have withdrawn them, established by hunting associations across the country. We've talked about a number of hunting rifles that are commonly used. The SKS, for example, is used as a hunting rifle very commonly in Indigenous communities and others. So it's just a bit frustrating in that regard. And it's not clear on capacity. I recognize that's been informed now. It's clear now it's not in the bill, but magazine capacity does impact a lot of these firearms, and it's disappointing we don't really get to ask any questions about that. Also, the Firearms Advisory Committee, this is a question I will put. Is this included in the bill, this new Firearms Advisory Committee? Because the minister, when asked about the SKS, he said, well, we're going to refer, regarding banning that, we're referring it to this Firearms Advisory Committee. So is that in this bill? Is that being brought forward through this bill to the officials?
If the officials wish to respond, please go.
Thank you. So I would refer to the news release and the speaking that was published yesterday. The intent to reestablish the Canadian Firearms Advisory Committee was announced by the minister yesterday, and the information about that is, as part of that, we're waiting for instructions from the minister.
Okay, so that's not being created through this bill, just to be clear.
Nope.
No. Okay. Again, Mr. Chair, just to conclude, we were provided a technical briefing basically minutes after getting the slide deck for all of this. We are getting a lot of questions. The minister himself is responsible for this because he announced it within the scope of C21 announcements that we're talking about today. So I would appreciate, and I think members of the media, stakeholders, other members of Parliament would appreciate a fulsome briefing now that we've had a bit more time to digest what these amendments mean, what the capacity magazine restrictions will mean, what is the makeup of this Firearms Advisory Committee, who's going to be on that, how is that decided, how can gun owners trust that that won't be biased, like basic questions that we need answers to, Mr. Chair. So I would ask that you consult as the lead on public safety with the Parliamentary Secretary for Public Safety on providing another amendment. And I believe there is time, because we know now there won't be any more time for another public safety meeting this week when we know Liberals were supportive of that. So now that that time's freed up, why not have a technical briefing where you can ask a little bit more questions now that we've had time to digest this and have a few more answers from officials? So Mr. Chair, perhaps you can respond if you will have that conversation with the Parliamentary Secretary, and then I'm done.
Thank you for your input. We're focused on this bill and on this amendment, and I'm really going to focus our conversation on this bill and this amendment. Many of the things you spoke of are discussed. They're outside of the scope of this bill. They're outside of the scope of this amendment. There are certainly things that you can bring up with the minister going forward. And with that, I believe next on my list is Mr. Julian, followed by Mr. Nur Mohammed. Mr. Julian, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief. I mean, I think Ms. Dancho has shown that she has had questions answered because she's establishing a narrative around this particular amendment. So she does say, and I take her at her word, that this isn't a filibuster. And so the repetitive nature of some of those questions, or the questions that go beyond the bill, are something that she says is helpful to have her do the analysis of the amendment. And I would go and ask her, through you, Mr. Chair, then I believe that Conservatives should consent to additional meetings. If that is indeed the case, if they have an understanding now of the amendment, if what they're trying to do is get answers, that is certainly their prerogative. What I find disturbing is at the same time as they're using up this committee time, which is their prerogative, they are refusing to have additional meetings. And that's the problem, Mr. Chair, I think. If we're talking about a potential filibuster, or if that's the intent of the Conservatives, again, at this rhythm, it will take us until October, not this year, but next year, 2024, to complete clause-by-clause analysis of this bill. Ghost guns are right now at an epidemic level in certain parts of the country, and the provisions in this bill that deal with ghost guns and crack down on criminals are needed. So I hope that the Conservatives consent to those additional meetings, because they're obviously needed, and I don't object to them asking questions. I do object when there are clearly questions that have either already been answered or that have nothing to do with the bill. I do object to that. I find that that's not a useful use of our committee time. But if the Conservatives are not filibustering, then I think they can show good faith by agreeing to a substantial number of other committee meetings, so that we're not in this same position in October 2024, when law enforcement have said the provisions around ghost guns are needed now.
Thank
Mr.
you,
Chair, I
Mr.
can
Julian.
respond if you'd like me to.
No, I think we have to carry on with the proper.
Okay,
We'll
I'm
put
just
you
saying,
back
he
on the list.
posed it to me. All right. No, I don't need to respond, but he posed it to me.
Mr. Nur Mohammed, please go ahead.
I will be extremely brief. I think there's a couple of things to note. One is that there have been technical briefings that were held. On the last one, I understand there were only 2 questions asked. The great thing is that we have all but one of the officials that were on that briefing in the room today. And so I would invite those that are concerned to ask questions to those very same officials who are seated right here. And I note that there hasn't been a whole lot of time given to officials to actually answer questions, but a whole lot of talking. So I think if we're going to express concerns about not being able to get information, we should avail ourselves of the individuals who are the experts and
Point of
who have been
order,
part of
Mr.
this.
Chair.
So,
point of order, Mr. Nur Mohammed is misleading the committee.
Miss
Technical briefing yesterday.
Miss Stancho, please
Well,
wait
he's
to be
misleading the
recognized.
committee, Mr.
Please
Chair.
wait to be recognized. And I take your point. It's not a point of order, and we'll carry on with Mr. Nur Mohammed.
So we have officials in the room who are the ones who know what is going on the best in terms of the specific content. We have an opportunity to ask them questions, and I think it's important that we avail ourselves of the opportunity, given that they are here sitting at 6:32 in the evening, and we should take advantage of that. So again, I would invite all to ask those questions. I do want to make one very, very important point to everybody that is watching this and following this. We've heard a lot of rhetoric about how people are coming after things like the Lee Enfield. And I want to be very, very clear about something. There are 4 elements to the technical definition. 1, that it's not a handgun. 2 is that it discharges centerfire ammunition from a semi-automatic manner, designed with a detachable cartridge, the capacity of 6 cartridges or more, and that it's designed and manufactured on or day after in which this paragraph comes into force. So it is important that we not mislead people into thinking that something is happening that is not. I don't want to say much more than that, but if we're going to have thoughtful debate on these amendments, let's ground those conversations in facts, because Canadians deserve that. And if we're going to move forward on doing good gun legislation together, people need to be working from the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Nur Mohammed. We go now to Mr. Shipley.
Thank you, Chair. And just a couple quick questions as we move along here. I think it was touched on a little bit earlier, but I will admit I missed the point. I'm just need some clarification, and we're going to stick to the amendment here because that's what I know we're being asked to do. This amendment that is defining the definition of prohibited firearm. And I've already earlier voiced my concerns that I don't think this was very well written. I'm not going to go through that again. But what kind of confuses me was, if this is such a great definition of a prohibited firearm, and this is the way forward and not going retroactive, at the same time, the public safety minister announced that there would also be a firearms advisory committee that will determine future bans of firearms that are presently owned by law-abiding Canadian gun owners. If we have this definition, and if we have this amendment that we're all talking about here now for hours and hours, why do we need, or what is this Firearms Advisory Committee going to be due to set up? Perhaps someone on the expert panel could brief me on that.
So the intent that the minister announced is in the publicly available news release that was put out yesterday. I could read the news release if you like. But it's outside of the scope of this bill. So they talk about reestablishing the Canadian Firearms Advisory Committee to independently review the classification of existing firearms, talking about a diverse membership, expert recommendations, appoint the committee with a certain number of time, and seek a recommendation within a certain amount of time after that.
Thank you. I think I heard that it was very soft. Maybe I should have grabbed my earpiece. I apologize. I heard from the other side saying that it's nothing to do with this amendment, but I disagree, because we're talking about firearms and the definition and going forward. So they both go kind of hand in hand. It's tough for me to make a decision on one amendment, not knowing what the go forward path is. That's all I'm trying to bring up on that. So I do have some other questions, but I think I'll give the floor up for now, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Shipley. We go now to Mr. Motz, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again for our officials for your patience. You know, the definition based on this new clause in 84.1, and I read that before I came here today, and what you're striking out, that it's a firearm that is not a handgun, and that discharges center-fired ammunition in a semi-automatic manner, which is hunting rifles and shotguns, which was originally designed, and I've heard from the RCMP, Ms. Paquette, that it's the specifications, what originally designed means, with a detachable cartridge magazine with the capacity of 6 cartridges or more, and is designed and manufactured on or after the date on which this paragraph comes into force. So with that as a potential definition, do our experts and those who are legislative assistants to look at this particular one, does this fit a definition or fit the moniker that has been placed on the demand of this government that they ban military-style assault firearms? Does this definition fit that or this definition here fit what you would commonly think of as a military-style assault firearm?
So the definition as proposed captures technical characteristics of firearms that are, of the government's opinion, that are not suitable for civilian use and that pose a risk to public safety.
Okay, so again, maybe I'll ask the RCMP, who are into more classification of firearms, does this definition fit anything to do with a military-style assault firearm?
I have the same answer.
Get the same answer. Interesting. Okay. Again, so that kind of proves my point that there is no such definition. There is no such firearm that exists in this country that isn't already prohibited, a military-style assault firearm. I received an email on this exact issue earlier this week. I guess that would be yesterday. This fellow has 32 years serving Canadians, and he doesn't understand why in the world the assault is being used to describe a firearm in Canada. And this does apply to this, because I hope at the end of this, I never hear that ludicrous phrase used to describe firearms again in this country and what the Liberals are planning to do on their virtual signaling. Anyway, he goes on to say, Canadians need to be educated that there are 6 action types of firearms. Semi-automatic is one of the actions of the 6 and can be defined in the Firearms Act and regulations. And I won't go into the definition because you've basically provided that definition here. And we know fully automatic firearms are prohibited in Canada, and and have been for 40 years. And the only Canadians who have them as a collector item are able to have those type of firearms. And they cannot be taken to the range. They can't be transported them without an ATT, and that ATT has to be issued by the CFO. This gentleman goes on to say that he's been doing his job as an instructor for the RCMP, the Canadian Armed Forces, throughout his career, and he's a verified officer for the RCMP. He was really curious to know who the verification officers that are describing firearms as assault style, because it doesn't exist. And this is not pegged at you officials, because I know that that's not a term that you have said, but you're trying to, I suppose, forced to defend it, because the Minister of Public Safety, the Prime Minister, and other individuals have virtual signaled to Canadians that the assault style is a firearm that they're intend to take off the streets. There's no such firearm category of the 6 action styles in this country, is what this individual has said, which I agree with, that aren't already prohibited. He, like I said, he's a Canadian Firearms instructor, he's a Canadian Firearms verification officer, he's a range safety officer, he's a canine handler. These are people who are in the field, who are operational, who deal with this stuff daily, and who this government has caused a confusion and are certainly confusing the Canadian public on the use of terms. And as I said, my hope is that when this, with this definition, and I don't know whether it'll pass or not, with this definition, I hope that no one ever uses that term again to describe the firearms that you're trying to prohibit, because this does not fit that category. And you talk to military people, which my colleague beside me has been one for many, many years. They will tell you unequivocally that the firearms being branded with that name, they would never, ever, ever take into battle, because their life depends on it. So I just hope that, if there's officials here that have an ear with the public safety minister, that they get that term out of their mind, because it's driving people bonkers, because there's no such term. And all it is fear-mongering, nothing but fear-mongering to those in the Canadian public who don't understand the current firearm legislation and don't understand the strictness of our firearm laws and what they do for Canadians. I will leave it at that for now, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. Mr. Ruff, please.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I have a couple very quick points. So I know Mr. Julian's raised the concerns about, the debate that's ongoing and how long it's going to take, specifically because of his concerns around the increased threat across this nation with respect to ghost guns. And I fully agree, and I think that's why you saw unanimous support at the motion that we just passed. So my question to the officials: there is nothing preventing the current government from prohibiting and taking what is in this legislation tied to ghost guns and passing that through regulation tomorrow, is there?
So there's certain provisions or measures that are being proposed in here that are ones that need to be based in law. They're not ones that are to be included in regulations, because you either need the regulation making authority to do so in terms of taking those regulatory actions. So some of them are actually are necessary as part of the bill, if that's the government and the legislature's intent.
Gotcha. So, and that's a fair response. I respect that there's aspects of it that do require legislative change. So, and my second point more goes to, the discussion of why, there is some concerns and confusion around here. I know we already challenged you, Chair, on the scope of this, but it goes to the question around the tech briefing. And I just want it clear so all Canadians that are watching or are reviewing this. The tech briefing, we got notified very last minute. In fact, we received the link for those MPs less than 20 minutes before the brief actually occurred. I sent a follow-up, in fact, to the parliamentary secretary. Hey, it's at the 45-minute mark. Where is this? We had it. When the questions came up, there was only 2 people, myself and Mr. Motz, and we were restricted to 1 question each with a follow-up. I had a pile more, and before we knew it, the tech brief was over. And again, nothing against any of the officials that were part of the brief yesterday, but it was over so quick, and I know talking to other colleagues, and again, that's my concern here. This amendment was not debated. We'd had that discussion at length on the previous amendments. This wasn't part of the original bill. So we have 330, well, not quite 338 MPs in the House of Commons right now with the resignations. My point is, we had the, we have all sorts of our colleagues that represent Canadians right across this country that are still asking us questions. And I think that, I guess, just to go back to the previous point, we do kindly request to the government and to the parliamentary secretary that you do consider offering another technical brief opportunity for all MPs, not just those that have the benefit of our wonderful officials here at the table. So I'll leave my remarks at that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ruff. Ms. Dancho, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I do have one question, and then I have a suggestion that may hurry this along that committee members may be open to, but I'll come to that in a minute. So just on the technical briefing, I want to impress upon how important it is that we do get these answers. Mr. Mohammed mentioned something about the Lee Enfield. I haven't got a clear answer of the Lee Enfield and the Winchester rifle 1873, which is a tubular magazine, will be impacted by what the minister said when he announced this amendment about the high capacity magazine permanent alterations. These are legitimate questions we are getting. People watching this committee have these questions. It is the minister's fault that he announced them at the same time, perhaps. I don't know, but he made that connection himself. So that's why we've come to this committee looking for answers if the high capacity permanent alteration announcement will impact tubular magazines and the Lee Enfield. That would put a lot of concerns aside if the government could be clear, if the Liberal members could be clear right now and guarantee to Canadians that tubular magazines and the Lee Enfield will not be impacted by the minister's announcement yesterday. That would cause us to relax, I think, a bit, because those would be huge changes. So I want to suggest something to help us move forward. So, Mr. Chair, if you can just come back to me, but I put it to Liberal members if they wish to engage in this. Can you guarantee to Canadians that tubular magazines and the Lee Enfield will not be banned by the minister's announcement yesterday?
Thank you, Ms. Dancho. I really need us to focus on this bill and this amendment. This amendment explicitly excludes firearms such as the Lee Enfield, the SKS, all those things. It doesn't apply. It's nothing to do with any existing firearm. So if you have those suggestions to make, by all means bring them up with the minister offline or the parliamentary secretary offline. It's not really part of what we're doing in this meeting at this time. Go ahead.
Okay, well then I will go to my suggestion then, but just to wrap that point up, it would provide a lot of clarity to Canadians who own these firearms to know that they're not being banned. It is the minister's fault that he connected these two things yesterday in the announcement. Just to be clear, and Liberal members do have an opportunity right now to denounce or to assure that these aren't being banned, but they have chosen not to. Anyway, I will go on to suggest that I believe, Mr. Chair, you can confirm this, if we have unanimous consent to park this, we can actually get to the rest of the bill and we can come back to this clause. So we can get started on the other clauses, ghost guns and other things. Again, I don't think there's a lot of issues forthcoming in other clauses. Conservative members obviously have more questions about this and about the announcement yesterday. It may give me an opportunity to speak with the minister. Perhaps another technical briefing would come. And then when we do get back to this clause, if we decide to park it for a minute, that could go more quickly. But again, we're very hesitant. The track record of the Liberals has not built trust concerning these new type of definitions. So we're hesitant. The rest of the bill amendments look not too bad. I don't think there'll be any issues there. So I would ask, I could put forward a motion that we pause this clause for now and come back to it and get going on the rest of the bill. So I could put forward a motion if there's willingness. If there's not, then I won't waste more time. But
a motion at this time would be out of order because we are engaged in a motion. We can't park an individual amendment. We can park, if you will, we can stand the whole clause and return to the whole clause later on. But that would stand all the amendments relating to that one clause that have not yet been processed.
Oops, I suppose that's what I'm suggesting then, Mr. Chair, so we can get on with it. And then Conservatives can get the answers we need.
Okay.
In the
so
interim, so we're not wasting committee time.
Okay, so I think I don't know if that's.
Can we get a response from the clerk, please? Just on the technicality of this, so I can be clear if I can move something.
I have just consulted with the legislative clerk. So we require unanimous consent to do this. So do we have unanimous consent to stand this clause and proceed with it another time? I see no unanimous consent. So we need to carry on with this discussion.
Okay, Mr. Chair, then I'm going to have to continue because we need some more answers here. We need more clarity. We don't trust that there isn't something being pulled over gun owners right now. And given the track record of Liberals on this committee and the minister, I think it's reasonable that we have this hesitation for this specific definition of what is being done today. It just doesn't follow. It doesn't make sense based on the rhetoric that they would bring forward this forward-looking clause. And I haven't heard any explanation of why that is being done. I also am not reassured that this Firearms Committee is not going to impact, it's not just a backdoor of banning the very long list that they withdrew. It sounds like from the minister yesterday that could be the case. Again, I don't know why he would announce these things together if we couldn't talk about it in the context of C21 today in this committee and get real answers about the composition of that committee, about high capacity magazines. Why he would confuse people, I don't understand, given the mass confusion he created with these amendments a few months ago. So to convolute these things, that's not on us. That's on the minister for doing that. And it's frustrating that we can't get clarity on what a Firearms Advisory Committee would look like, what they're allowed to do, what is the deal with high-capacity magazines, are Lee Enfields being banned, are tubular magazines being banned? So just to be clear, Conservatives are quite disappointed. We cannot get clarity for gun owners on this, given their reasonable apprehension and fear created over the last 5 months, given G4 and G46. So, Mr. Chair, that's all that I have at this time. But again, I would urge you to urge the Parliamentary Secretary to talk to the Minister about another technical briefing that could certainly help things go along, especially considered that good faith measure to park this clause for now to get to the rest of the bill was not approved, which would allow us to get to the other important measures and get more answers in the interim. I think that was a good faith measure. I certainly made it in good faith. So I don't know why we can't do that, but anyway, that's all for now, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Dancho. So we have Mr. Mott, followed by Ms. Demoff, followed by Madame Michaud, followed by Mr. Julian.
Thank you, Chair. I have just a few questions for the officials, and they've been asked before in other aspects of other bills, and I know this one. So, in your best, to the best of your knowledge, was there any gender-based analysis completed for this particular amendment?
I believe I've answered this previously, but I might be incorrect.
Not today, you didn't.
Any analysis that is taken with respect to the motions or the bill would be solicitor-client privilege. But there are a variety of factors that we do look at as council when we are developing policy, and one of those factors is gender-based analysis.
Okay, that's a very political answer. You sure you're in the right role? No.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. This is
I have a question.
Going after and asserting that officials of the government are somehow acting as partisan individuals is not okay. I mean, there's a line that we in this committee don't cross, and to my mind, that's crossing the line.
Well,
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed, and I would recommend to Mr. Motz that he respect the witnesses.
I have great respect for these witnesses, contrary to what my colleague might suggest with the disinformation across the way. So what you are telling me then that generally a gender-based analysis is conducted, but can you confirm in this particular with this particular amendment that there was a gender-based analysis conducted?
So I can repeat my last answer and say that when we look at developing policy, including motions, such as the motions before the committee today, we do a variety of analysis, including gender-based analysis. So that would have been part of something that we would have done.
Okay.
And I can't tell you, like I said, the outcome of that analysis, but what I can say is that it does form part of our policy analysis when we are developing policy.
Okay, thank you. So as part of that analysis you would do, and I take it when you talk about motions, you're talking about new stuff that comes forward, and I suspect that's what you're meaning. Was there any evidence that that was presented to those drafting this and to the department that showed that this particular amendment, this G 3.2, would have a positive impact on public safety?
So any statistical or evidentiary evidence that we would have in the process of the policy development, again, would be solicitor-client privilege included within our analysis of the amendments.
Okay. I'm hoping that my colleagues across the way can at some point in time provide any such evidence that would suggest that this amendment would have positive impact on public safety. I'm not sure that it meets that threshold. Are there any statistics showing that these legally owned firearms are being used in the commission of offenses that then would force the government to develop this type of definition to this amendment?
Can I ask which firearms you're speaking to?
What that could be covered off or relating to the new definition in G 3.2.
So the definition is a qualitative definition. Right. There is no list or schedule that lists any of those kinds of firearms. So I don't think we can actually provide that information, but I will turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Mainville-Dale.
So the new definition that is being proposed is one that's based on technical characteristics that the government has determined or made a decision proposal that are not suitable for civilian use and that pose a risk to public safety.
Okay, again, thank you. That's a fair statement. However, I think it just shows that who's ever playing the music for your officials to dance to has a kind of a misguided approach. So to me, there has to be some evidence somewhere. There's got to be, in Stats Canada, with RCMP, law enforcement across the country have to have some evidence to suggest that basically what you're describing here are hunting rifles and shotguns pose such a significant threat to the safety of Canadians that we have to develop the government feels that they have to, develop a definition that fits, that fits that category of firearm. It goes after hunters and sport shooters basically, and it is it is a little disconcerting that that's still a definition that is possible to have here, and we need to be aware of that. I just have a couple more. Are you aware that the minister talked about consultations? We don't know who all he consulted with. We know some, because some have reached out to us about.
Mr. Motz, I'm afraid we've run out of time. So you have the floor. We will resume this debate. I'm sorry? Mr. Julian, on point of order.
Yeah, I just wanted to, in response to the issue around the Firearms Advisory Committee, it was established under the Harper government in 2006, so the Conservatives can get information from their own folks on that. I really am saddened by this filibuster.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. So, Mr. Motz, when we resume, you will have the floor, and you may continue your questioning at that point. Thank you once again to officials. Thank you to our legislative clerk and our analysts and all of our committee staff. It's really great to see you guys again. I think we'll be seeing a lot more of you. So thank you. And with that, we are now adjourned.